What's a story that you've heard that still gives you chills to this day? Story 1. My friend once told me about something that happened to her when she was about 8 or 9 years old. She was walking home from school and got her key out to unlock the door to her house. Her single mother, who worked during the day, usually came home later on weekdays. As my friend reached up to insert the key into the lock, the door suddenly opened. Her mother, wearing a dressing gown and looking unwell, stood there. She had stayed homesick that day. Instead of greeting her daughter, her mother immediately looked past her and asked, "Who are you?" Startled, my friend turned around and saw a man in a long coat hurriedly walking back down the path and disappearing down the street. Her mother's unexpected illness and presence at home that day might have saved her daughter from something truly terrible. Story 2. A few years ago, I worked as a vet tech, and one day a man came in with his elderly dog to have it put to sleep. We followed the standard euthanasia protocol, gathering a basic history, asking if the owner wanted to be present, and so on. When one of my coworkers asked if he wanted to be there during the procedure, the man replied, "Yes, because I lost both of my boys last week, and I wasn't there for them. I'll be damned if I'm not here to say goodbye to my last living family member." We later learned that his sons had died overseas. After hearing his story, our entire staff went into the euthanasia room and hugged him and his dog for several minutes, even after his dog had peacefully passed. In all my years in the field, I've never encountered someone as heartbroken as this man saying goodbye to his beloved pet. Story 3. Yeremia Rasam Cern Pindindo. When I was about 17, I went out back to take out the trash and heard a strange noise in the backyard that spooked me. I ran back inside and everyone laughed at me until my mom said she thought she heard something in the basement. Suddenly, we all felt uneasy because we knew the outside door to the basement was open. My mom, who usually says if people are overreacting, decided to call the cops because she was so certain of the noise she'd heard. About an hour and a half later, it was around 2 a.m. by then, the cops still hadn't arrived, and we'd kind of moved on since we hadn't heard anything else. We were sitting on the front porch, off to the side and out of the light, when a car slowly came down the block. The driver turned off the headlights 2 houses down and stopped just past our driveway. We froze, afraid to move, as the driver got out, retrieved something from the trunk, and walked off down the block. At that point, we decided we'd had enough of the creepy night and went back inside, locking the doors behind us. As soon as we got inside, the car left. About an hour later, an officer finally showed up. We told them everything, saying we probably just heard raccoons in the backyard, but we were now more concerned about the strange car. The officer left, and we eventually went to bed. The rest of the night was quiet. The next evening, around 11 or 12, my mom burst into my room, saying there were a bunch of emergency vehicles outside. We all went outside, and of course, all we could talk about was what had happened the night before. After a few minutes, my mom walked over to the news crews to find out what was going on. It turned out that our neighbor had been attacked. A man broke into their home, shot the husband, and robbed the wife. Story 4. My grandfather's second wife was a sleepwalker, the kind who would get up in the middle of the night and do things like make a sandwich in the kitchen. My grandfather got used to it, and whenever he woke up to find her missing from bed, he'd gently lead her back without waking her, just as he'd been advised. One night he woke up and noticed she wasn't lying beside him. Instead, she was sitting on the edge of the bed with her back turned to him. He called her name to ask what was wrong, but she didn't respond, and he realized she must be asleep. He could tell she was doing something with her hands, holding something in her lap, but he couldn't see what it was. Sitting up, he leaned over her shoulder to get a closer look. That's when he saw what she was doing. Still asleep, loading his revolver. Story 5. Tumesuanan. When I was about 4 and my sister was nearly 1, my parents had been divorced for a few months. My mother decided to drive us from Las Vegas to Wichita to visit our grandparents. During one stop at a gas station, a man approached our car and said to my mother, "I hate to see a single mother traveling alone. I noticed we're heading in the same direction. Would you like me to follow you for a while to make sure you're safe?" She politely declined, saying, "No thanks," and we drove off. At the next gas station stop, the same man appeared again, this time claiming he was just checking on us. It turned out he had been following us since the last stop. As he spoke to my mother, the wind blew his sport coat open, and I saw a gun tucked into his pants. After my mom once again said we were fine and drove off, I told her what I had seen. While driving, my mom wrote a note detailing who we were, where we planned to spend the night, and a description of the creepy man following us. She asked the next gas station attendant to contact the police in the town where we'd be staying and let them know the situation. When we arrived at the next gas station, my mom quickly handed the clerk the note and drove off in a hurry. At the hotel, the manager had police officers waiting in one room and gave us another room with pizza and soda. Later that night, the man showed up and asked the manager if his wife and kids had checked in and which room they were in. The manager handed him the key to the room with the police. The officers questioned him and discovered he was a convicted rapist with a warrant out for his arrest. He was taken into custody, and thanks to my mom's quick thinking, we were safe. Story 6. When Chinese basketball star Yao Ming walked through the National Stadium during the opening ceremony of the Olympics, all eyes were on him. But few people paid attention to the little boy walking beside him. That boy was Lin Hao, a 9-year-old survivor of the devastating Sichuan earthquake in May. The international press reported Lin as an earthquake survivor, but what many missed was the full extent of his bravery. Lin, who attended Uzixi Primary School in Wenchuan County, near the quake's epicenter, not only survived but went back into the rubble after escaping to save 2 of his classmates. During the rescue, Lin was struck by falling debris, suffering injuries to his head and arms. Despite his pain, he encouraged the remaining 10 survivors from his class of 32 to sing songs together to keep their spirits up while they waited for help. When asked why he risked his life to save others, Lin replied, "I was the hall monitor. It was my job to look after my classmates." His courage and selflessness were a moving tribute to the resilience of those affected by the earthquake and a moment of pride for the nation during the Olympic ceremony. Story 7. When I was in elementary school, a student at my school was involved in a horrific tragedy, a triple homicide suicide. His father killed his mother, his brother, and then him before taking his own life. According to the news, it happened in the middle of the night while they were sleeping. But I couldn't stop imagining what it must have been like to be in that house during those moments. After the first murder, everyone in the house would have woken up. The thought of being surrounded by the people you've loved and trusted your whole life, only to witness them being taken away one by someone you looked up to, is terrifying. The child was only 10 or 11. It was incredibly sad. What made it even worse was that in high school, a similar incident happened in my city. It wasn't someone from my school this time, but the house where it happened was less than a mile from where I lived. These kinds of events are so unsettling, especially when they happen so close to home. Story 8. 2 years ago, I was in a car wreck that nearly killed me. It happened late at night as I was driving home. I fell asleep at the wheel and crashed into a tree on the driver's side. I don't remember anything from the accident or the days immediately following, but I woke up in the ICU, strapped to a bed with a respirator and a feeding tube. My injuries were severe. I had broken bones in my skull and collarbone. Both of my lungs had collapsed, and my diaphragm was ruptured. Every doctor I've seen since has told me it's a miracle I survived. The most chilling part of the story is how I was found. A couple who lived in my neighborhood had just dropped their daughter off at a bus headed to camp, where she was working as a counselor. The bus had been delayed by an hour and a half because a few other counselors were late. One of them was my best friend from elementary school. On their way home, the couple noticed a car parked on the wrong side of the road. It was dark, and they couldn't see any damage at first, so they kept driving. But then the wife thought she heard honking and convinced her husband to turn around. When they found me, I was unconscious. My car was completely dead, and the horn wasn't even functional. It was later confirmed to have been broken. They didn't know it was me until 2 days later. Their actions that night saved my life. If that bus hadn't been delayed, or if they hadn't decided to turn around, I wouldn't be here today. Story 9. When I was a Boy Scout, I earned the Filmmaking Merit Badge one winter camp. Part of the requirement was to create a short film, no matter how bad it turned out. Since we were in the woods, my group decided to make a slasher movie. The plot wasn't groundbreaking, a masked killer going around stabbing people at a Boy Scout camp, but we thought it would be fun. There was a kid named Paul in our group who was super likable and got along with everyone. We unanimously voted for him to play the killer because he had this creepy Peter Lorre eye thing going on. He did a great job fake stabbing everyone and being menacing for a movie made by 12 and 13-year-olds. We finished editing it, complete with buckets of fake blood and terrible acting, and I forgot about it for years. Fast forward 6 years. I was a freshman in college when I ran into Paul on campus. We hadn't kept in touch, but we made small talk about spring break plans and went our separate ways. A week later, I was back home watching the news when I saw a story about a young man who had killed his parents, 2 family dogs, and set their house on fire over spring break. The suspect's photo appeared on the screen, And it was Paul. You can probably guess how he did it. He stabbed them to death. Story 10. When I was 16 or 17, my friends and I often went camping in the mountains. We'd bring weed, beer, and sometimes acid. But I was always too scared to do much, probably because I took my parents' warnings to heart. That night, most of my friends were tripping on acid while I was sipping a beer, enjoying the fire. A group of us girls decided to head into the woods to pee, still too squeamish about the boys seeing us. One girl, who was really high, kept searching for the perfect spot, so we wandered deeper into the woods. Eventually, we reached a small clearing and decided to pee there. Afterward, as we were heading back to camp, one of the girls heard a low moan coming from the other side of the clearing. She told us to be quiet and listen, but we didn't hear it and urged her to come back with us. She insisted on investigating, so I went with her. We moved cautiously, our lantern's light barely reaching into the darkness. Suddenly, the light illuminated a car, a brand new looking Subaru. The sight of it startled us, and we ran back to the group screaming. When we told the boys, they teased us, saying we'd stumbled on another campsite, and we eventually laughed it off. 5 years later, I was in nursing school, working as an admin assistant in a labor and delivery hospital. One of my coworkers and I became close friends, and one night she told me about her father. He'd been missing since she was in high school. He had a history of suicide attempts, and her family assumed he had succeeded, though no body was ever found. She confided that she secretly hoped he had just run away to start a new life. Not long after, a man was discovered in a stolen Subaru up in the mountains where we used to camp. He had been there for years through every season and had taken his life with a hose running from the tailpipe to the car window. The discovery made the news, and one of my old high school friends called to remind me of that night in the woods. It was the same area, and the car we saw was likely his. Later, my coworker received a call from her mother. The man in the car was her father. We had heard him moaning. We had seen the car. If we hadn't been such scared kids, maybe we could have done something. Watching my friend fall apart over the news was heartbreaking, but I never told her about my experience in the woods. I've always carried the guilt with me. Story 11. The story of the girl who got lost in the Odessa catacombs in 2005 is haunting. I can only imagine the grim realization of being lost and alone in a seemingly endless maze of tunnels. At first, you might think it's just a matter of retracing your steps, but then the battery on your phone dies, plunging you into complete darkness. You're left feeling along the cold, damp walls as an eerie silence surrounds you, broken only by your footfalls and sobs. Your only company is your fears, regrets, and the crushing question of how you ended up in this nightmare when just hours ago you were drunkenly partying with friends. Days pass, and your cries into the void go unanswered. Hope of rescue fades. You realize no one is coming. Dehydrated, hungry, scared, and exhausted, you collapse, your body giving out long before help ever arrives. 2 years later, your remains are found, a tragic reminder of the fragility of life and the dangers of the unknown. Story 12. My Oma grew up in Wieslach, Germany, during the Holocaust and World War II. She rarely talks about that time, but when she does, her stories are chilling. She once mentioned that friends of hers would just disappear, but they were raised not to ask questions. The most haunting story she told me happened when she was playing by the railroad tracks with her friends. A large freight train passed by, and she heard scratching and screaming. It wasn't the sound of animals. She knew that sound well. This was different. Frightened, she ran home and asked her mother what it could have been. Her mother yelled at her to never ask questions like that again, to stay away from the tracks, and to speak to no one about it. The memory of that moment lingers, a glimpse into the horrors of that time. Story 13. 5 years ago, I responded to a call for a respiratory emergency. As we left the station, dispatch updated us that the patient had gone unresponsive, urging us to expedite. When we arrived, the house was dilapidated and unsettling. The family living there was pale, dirty, and constantly moving in and out of rooms, which only added to the unease. We were eventually directed upstairs, where we found the patient half underneath a bed, completely naked and eerily reminiscent of the girl from The Ring. I tried to focus on CPR despite the overwhelming stench of cat urine and feces, the strange symbols on the walls, and the blood and filth-covered mattress. Unfortunately, she didn't survive. Afterward, we informed the family along with the police and paramedics. One family member, the daughter, was around my age and seemed particularly unsettling. She was also nearly naked, staring into the room where her mother had been, and her presence unnerved me. A few days later, I was driving my girlfriend to dinner after stopping at work to pick up my paycheck. As we approached the house, I noticed the stained mattress on the curb. My girlfriend found it creepy, but for me, it was a chilling reminder of the call. Then as we passed the house again, I saw the daughter standing on the sidewalk, staring at the mattress. When my car passed, she looked up, locking her eyes on me. The way she looked at me was terrifying. Her expression was hungry, like she somehow recognized me despite the unmarked car and the traffic around us. It's a moment that haunts me to this day. I don't know how she knew it was me, but that look will stay with me forever. Story 14. This story involves my mom and her close encounter with the infamous Scarborough rapist. When she was in her early 20s, she managed a photography studio in a mall in Scarborough, Ontario. One day, while working alone, a man walked in and asked for a photo. He was acting a bit strange and mentioned needing a picture of his hip. My mom assumed it was for a court case. They often did injury photos, so she started preparing the camera. When she looked up, the man had dropped his pants and was exposing himself. My mom, unfazed, started laughing hysterically and told him to get out, saying she didn't have time for such nonsense. About an hour later, a girl who worked at a denim store down the hall came by to share that a pervert had exposed himself to customers in her store. They laughed it off, assuming he was just mentally unstable. 2 days later, the same girl ran into my mom's studio, pale and shaken. She showed her the front page of the newspaper, which featured a sketch of the man with the headline, Scarborough Rapist. It was chilling to realize how close my mom had come to being attacked by Paul Bernardo during the peak of his crime spree. Story 15. When I was in my early teens, my parents would go out dancing on Friday nights, leaving me home alone. We lived in a quiet, rustic house, isolated except for a sawmill and a defunct car garage. Our closest neighbor was about a mile away. I'd use those nights to blast heavy metal albums on my parents' amazing stereo system. One evening, I put on Metallica's And Justice for All and headed to the restroom in a far corner of the house. As Blackened blared in the distance, the bass made it feel like the floor was shaking. When I returned to the living room, I noticed the chain on the front door was vibrating in rapid rhythms. I thought to myself, wow, the bass on this system is incredible. Then in the middle of the song, the chain abruptly stopped moving. I never figured out why, but the memory still gives me chills. Story 16. When my uncle was 4, he spent the summer at his aunt's house. Since there weren't any kids his age around, he entertained himself by riding his bike through the neighborhood. One day he ventured too far and got lost. A car pulled over and the man inside told him it was okay. He'd drive him back to his aunt's house. Trusting the stranger, my uncle loaded his bike into the car and got in. At first, my uncle thought the man was one of his aunt's friends, so he didn't question him. But when the car turned onto the highway, he became confused and started asking where they were going, telling the man that his aunt's house wasn't near the highway. The man said nothing and kept driving. Eventually, the man pulled over on the side of the road, looking deep in thought. After a few moments, he turned the car around and drove my uncle back to the entrance of the neighborhood, dropping him off before speeding away. Years later, my uncle realized what had happened. The man had likely intended to kidnap him, but changed his mind at the last moment. It's a chilling thought to imagine how differently things could have turned out. Story 17. This story is about my dad. When he was around 10 or 12, he and a friend were playing near a small river in southern Wisconsin. It was freezing cold and they noticed a capsized canoe in the water. 2 men, likely fishermen, were clinging to it for dear life, blue from the cold and barely able to speak. My dad and his friend managed to pull the men out of the water, saving their lives. It became a big deal in their town, even making it into the local paper. Fast forward about 5 years. My dad, now a teenager, was driving to a concert in Chicago with the same friend in his new car. They weren't wearing seatbelts. It was the 70s after all. And as they passed a bar, a mobile home flew out of the parking lot into the street. The driver, likely drunk, hadn't looked, and my dad crashed head-on into the trailer. The car was totaled, but not wearing seatbelts somehow saved their lives as the impact propelled them forward and upward, avoiding the crushed bottom half of the car. Shaken but unharmed, they got out of the car just as the propane tank on the trailer exploded, engulfing it in flames. 2 men stumbled out, screaming in agony, their skin blistering and bubbling. They died right there in front of a crowd that had gathered from the bar. My dad later discovered that these 2 men were the very same fishermen he and his friend had saved 5 years earlier. Life has a strange, dark sense of irony. Story 18. In my senior year of high school, I took a class on genocide. Toward the end of the course, several Holocaust survivors came to speak with us. One man's story stood out. He recounted a moment when he was rummaging through garbage in a concentration camp, searching for food, and was caught by a guard. The guard forced him to kneel, and he felt the cold barrel of a gun against his neck. Just as he thought his life was over, a thick fog rolled in, distracting the guard. Suddenly, he heard a clang and the sound of footsteps. When the fog cleared, he saw a bloody shovel on the ground and realized another prisoner had struck the guard and fled. The man said he had spent his life wishing to thank the stranger who had saved him that day. 3 speakers later, another man shared his story. He spoke about a night in the camp when he was searching for food and saw another prisoner being caught by a guard. He was terrified but saw a shovel nearby when a thick fog rolled in. Acting on instinct, he grabbed the shovel, struck the guard, and ran back to his bunk. He lamented never seeing the man he saved again. The entire room erupted as we realized that the two men were talking about the same event. They were brought together after nearly 70 years and immediately embraced, breaking down in tears. Amazingly, they had been living only 4 miles apart for the last 40 years. Story 19. As a funeral director, I once had a man come in who had lost his teenage daughter. She was a daddy's girl, and her death devastated him. He spared no expense for her burial, buying the best casket in a high-quality vault. But after her interment, he began having recurring nightmares. In every dream, his daughter was drowning, in a bathtub, the ocean, or a car that had plunged off a bridge. Every time he could hear her screaming, "Daddy, help me, I'm drowning." Drowning had nothing to do with her cause of death, so at first he chalked it up to grief. But the nightmares wouldn't stop. The man came back to us, desperate for answers. After hearing his story, we obtained a permit to dishonor her and move her to another cemetery. When the vault was opened, we discovered it was filled to the brim with water, despite being designed to keep water out. It was horrifying. After moving her to a different cemetery, the man's nightmares ceased. Sometimes it seems like the connection between the living and the dead goes deeper than we can understand. Story 20. When I was 18, I stayed alone at my parents' house while they went on a summer vacation. I lived in an outhouse on the property and never locked my room, thinking it was safe. On the third day, I visited a local haunted house where a gruesome family murder had taken place in the 80s. My friends joked about how eerie it would be if something happened to me that night, like a cliché horror movie. I brushed it off but grabbed my little brother's baseball bat and put it by my bed just in case. That night, I went to bed as usual, pulling the curtain closed on the window that overlooked my bed. Around 3 a.m., I was suddenly overcome by the feeling that someone was watching me. The silence was deafening, and I struggled to emerge fully from sleep. Part of me tried to dismiss it as a cat or something, but then I heard the creaky front door open. I froze, eyes wide open but unable to move. I saw a man step into my room, staring at me. He took 2 slow paces toward my bed, breathing heavily, and then, after what felt like an eternity, turned around and walked out. Eventually, I crawled out of bed, grabbed the bat, and crept to the door. It was open. So was the main house. Nothing was stolen, and I have no idea what happened or why, but it remains the most terrifying experience of my life. Story 21. A 16-year-old girl was house-sitting for a family friend. Late one night, she heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It wouldn't stop, but she was too scared to investigate alone. Fear creeping in, she decided to call 911, explaining the situation and telling them not to rush, as it was probably nothing. Within 2 minutes, several police officers arrived at the house. 4 of them went into the basement while one stayed with her outside. Moments later, she heard shouting, and the officers brought up a deranged-looking man. He had been sitting on the washer, banging a machete between it and the dryer, trying to lure her down. Shaken, she asked the officers how they knew someone was down there. They explained that when she had called 911 and hung up, the operator had heard a second click on the line. He had been listening. Story 22. I went 9 days without proper sleep due to a severe bout of insomnia, though I experienced microsleeps toward the end. By day 4, I began to hallucinate. Harmless things at first, like tiny 2-dimensional palm trees that would disappear when I looked at them from the wrong angle. But after a few more days, the hallucinations completely took over. I lived what felt like a parallel life. In reality, it lasted only 2 or 3 days, but in my mind, it spanned weeks. It didn't feel like a dream or a delusion. It felt completely real. To this day, I remember it as clearly as any other part of my life. When I finally crashed and slept, I woke up to find reality snapping back into place. The experience had taken a physical toll. I missed over a month of school. Initially, I couldn't function despite getting normal sleep, and eventually I became sick. The doctor suggested the insomnia had been the cause. The hardest part, though, was coming to terms with those 2 weeks that never actually happened. It wasn't that anything profound happened in the hallucination, but it was so vivid and real that I couldn't convince myself it wasn't. For a long time, I lived in fear of waking up again, unable to trust my surroundings or enjoy the good things in life. I worried the people I met or cared about might not even exist. Over time, the paranoia faded. I came to accept that no one can ever truly prove they're experiencing reality, so there's no point in doubting it. But even now, I remember those 2 weeks as clearly as any other memory. It's unsettling to think how fragile our perception of reality can be. Story 23. About 15 years ago, when I was 17 and in high school in Seattle, I hung out with friends who smoked and drank, though I didn't often join in. One night, a few of us from the soccer team went to Volunteer Park on Capitol Hill. It was a school night, but they wanted to smoke before heading home. The west side of the park had a lot of trees where you could hide and do things you didn't want to be seen doing. Everything started out normal, giggling, smoking, and hanging out. I took one hit off the blunt, intending to keep it light since my parents were picking me up later. I told my friends I'd go keep watch for cops and climbed one of the park's large evergreen trees with low, easy-to-climb branches. From about 20 feet up, I had a great view of the Space Needle and was enjoying the night. Then I heard branches snapping below me. I looked down and saw a man standing there, staring in the direction of my friends. About 25 feet away, I saw another man. Then I noticed more figures, about 15 men in total, forming a semicircle around where my friends were. They weren't cops or security, and there was no reason for them to be there at 11 p.m. I stayed still, terrified, waiting for what felt like forever before climbing down quietly and running toward the greenhouse in the park. About 50 feet away, I saw my friends sprinting out of the woods. They told me someone had tried to grab one of them, and the girl screamed, causing them all to run. I'll never forget that night. There's no telling what those men intended, but I've heard stories about people disappearing in Seattle parks. Be careful out there. Story 24. This story stuck with me because of its quiet, haunting nature. A friend of mine lived on Long Island in 2001, around the time of September 11th. I lived in California then, and still do, and though I barely knew anyone personally who died that day, the tragedy felt almost like a movie, something happening on TV, not in real life. Out of morbid curiosity, I asked my friend if she had any stories about that day. I suppose I was expecting tales of collapsing buildings, panic, and chaos, something that felt dramatic and movie-like. Instead, her story was simple and profoundly affecting. She told me she didn't personally know anyone who had died and hadn't been in Manhattan on that day. But she did mention one detail. Every morning, she went to the train station very early for work, long before most people arrived. Before September 11th, the parking lot was usually empty at that hour. Afterward, there were always 6 or 7 cars that never moved. Day after day, they accumulated parking tickets and chalk marks on their tires. Eventually, the authorities figured out those cars belonged to people who had never come back for them. That image, silent cars left behind, waiting for drivers who would never return, hit me harder than any footage or dramatic story. It wasn't exciting, and there was no action or heroism, just those cars quiet and abandoned, as mute reminders of lives that had been suddenly, violently ended. In that moment, the tragedy became real to me. It wasn't a spectacle or a dramatic tale. It was heartbreakingly simple. Those cars stood as somber markers of a loss that went far beyond anything I had ever seen on TV. Story 25. I grew up in a neighborhood on the outskirts of Oklahoma City where my grandparents had built our house. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and kids felt safe riding bikes and playing outside. However, 3 doors down from us was a house we all called the Murder House. Before I was born, a gruesome crime had occurred there. A man was brutally murdered, and his girlfriend was horrifically assaulted. The murder weapon, a machete, was found in a neighbor's backyard and was traced back to a neighborhood greenhouse. For years, it was assumed the murder was related to a drug deal gone bad, but the case went cold, and the house remained abandoned for as long as I could remember. My bedroom faced the street, and from the ages of 4 to 11, I would often wake up in the middle of the night feeling as though I was being watched. At the time, I didn't understand why I felt that way, but the sensation was unsettling. One day, my parents quietly installed blackout shutters in my room. I never questioned it and just accepted that they were there. We moved away when I was 11, and shortly after, someone bought and renovated the murder house. The events faded into the past. Then 2 years ago, at the age of 26, I was watching an episode of Cold Case Files when something about the story felt eerily familiar. Suddenly, the water tower from my hometown appeared on the screen, followed by the house from my childhood. The show revealed that the case had finally been solved. The murderer wasn't a drug dealer as initially suspected, but a peeping Tom who had been terrorizing the neighborhood for nearly 20 years. On the night of the murder, he had been peeking into the windows of that house when he saw the man's girlfriend. He attacked her, and when her boyfriend came to her defense, the murderer killed him. The revelation left me shaken. The peeping Tom had continued lurking in the neighborhood for years after the crime, looking into windows, including mine. My parents had installed the blackout shutters to protect me from his prying eyes. The man was eventually caught when another woman, living just 3 blocks from my old house, filed a peeping Tom complaint. A barefoot print in her garden matched one found at the original crime scene, finally bringing the nightmare to an end. Story 26. This is the story that made me believe in ghosts. When I was 12, my mom took me and a friend along while she got a haircut. Bored, my friend and I decided to walk down the street and window shop. A few stores down, we passed a parking lot where an elderly African-American woman sitting in her car waved us over. She seemed feeble and a bit out of it, but she begged us to go across the street to a salon her daughter owned. She said she was stuck in her car and needed her daughter's help. She kept repeating, "Please, just get my daughter." And I'm stuck in the car. Wanting to help, we crossed the street and went into the salon. As two pale kids walking into a predominantly African-American salon, we got some odd looks, but the staff eventually brought us to the manager. When we explained the situation, the manager went pale and looked visibly shaken. Her demeanor shifted from curious to distraught as she asked us a barrage of questions. Finally, with tears in her eyes, she told us her mother had died just a few months earlier in a terrible accident. She had been forced off a bridge, and her car sank in the water. Unable to free herself, she had drowned. Horrified, my friend and I ran back across the street, but there was no sign of the car or the woman. We asked the lot attendant if he had seen anyone matching her description, but he insisted no one like that had been there all shift. To this day, I can't explain what happened. We initially thought it might have been some elaborate prank, but the manager's reaction was too genuine to be fake. I've never doubted the supernatural since. Story 27. This is something that happened to me, and while it's not the scariest experience, it's deeply unsettling. I was living in an old, creaky house in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The house was the kind where every floorboard groaned, and the wind seemed to whistle through invisible cracks. One of my friends from the West Coast came to visit me for 3 weeks, bringing an absurd amount of luggage. 5 or 6 bags and even a squash racket. Don't ask me why. I let him crash on the futon in the front living room. One morning after a late night of drinking, he burst into my room shouting, "Fire! Fire!" I was hungover and groggy, barely registering his words, but I jumped out of bed. The floor was hot under my feet as I followed him into the hallway. I couldn't see flames, but I could hear the unmistakable roar of fire inside the walls. We ran outside to the front yard, where we could see black smoke pouring from the roof. That's when I noticed something strange. My friend's bags and suitcases were all neatly lined up on the lawn, including his squash racket. Apparently, before coming to warn me, he had made at least 2 trips to save his belongings. The fire had started in the basement furnace and spread through the walls, burning the very floor we'd been standing on. Not long after we escaped, the floor in much of the house collapsed into a fiery pit. The firemen told us we were incredibly lucky to have made it out alive. Story 28. My great-grandparents grew up in a small Cajun town in southern Louisiana, steeped in local folklore and superstition. Early in their marriage, they lived near a cane field, with a Catholic church on the other side. While they usually walked to church during the day, one evening, they decided to attend an evening mass. By the time they left the church, it was pitch black outside. Tired from the day's work, they opted to take a shortcut through the cane field instead of the long path around. The crickets chirped, and the crunch of cane stalks underfoot was their only guide in the dim moonlight. As they trudged through the field, my great-grandfather stopped to catch his breath. My great-grandmother, walking close behind him, bumped into him, and then they both froze. They heard a third set of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate thuds echoed behind them, crunching the cane stalks. Trying not to panic, they started walking again, careful not to upset whatever was following them. My great-grandmother noticed that the footsteps had an odd rhythm. Fear overwhelmed her, and she broke into a sprint. My great-grandfather followed, and the footsteps behind them grew faster. They reached the edge of the field and their house in sight, hearts pounding. Fumbling with the lock, they finally opened the door and rushed inside, slamming it behind them. Their usually fearless hunting dog, Kaiser, darted in after them, trembling and cowering in fear. Then came the banging. Something was scratching at the door, shaking it violently. My great-grandfather assumed it was some wild animal until the doorknob started to jiggle. Something outside was trying to turn it. He grabbed his rifle and stood guard all night while my great-grandmother slept. The shuffling and scratching continued until the first rays of sunlight. When they opened the door the next morning, they found it covered in deep scratch marks. My great-grandmother remained convinced for the rest of her life that they had been chased by the Rougarou, the Cajun werewolf. Story 29. When I was 7, my mom, sister, and I moved into a new house in Florida after my dad had passed away the year before from complications during a triple bypass. My sister and I had bedrooms upstairs connected by an open loft area. One night I woke up late and for some reason got out of bed and looked across the loft toward my sister's room. Clear as day, I saw a shadowy figure in the shape of a man standing at the top of the stairs. The house was pitch black. There was no light to cast such a shadow. Terrified, I jumped back into bed and cried myself to sleep, thinking it was a burglar. About 15 to 30 minutes later, I woke up again and cautiously checked the stairs. The shadow was gone, so I grabbed my little flashlight and headed downstairs toward my mom's room. Her door was slightly ajar, and as I peeked through the crack, I saw the same shadowy figure walking around her bed. It bent over her as though looking at her. I shined my flashlight on the floor in front of the door, and the figure jolted upright, turned to look at me, and then walked into the bathroom. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw. I'm an atheist and don't necessarily believe in spirits, but part of me wonders if it was my father checking in on us and kissing my mom goodbye one last time. Even now, recalling that moment sends shivers down my spine. Story 30. As a nurse, I've heard many eerie stories, but one my instructor shared during training has always stayed with me. It involved a nurse whose daughter was terminally ill with cancer. The daughter was in her late 20s or early 30s, with a husband and 2 small children. She was terrified of dying and kept expressing that fear to her family, saying she dreaded being alone when it happened. Her parents took turns staying with her at the hospital along with her husband. One night, it was her father's turn to stay home and care for the grandkids while her mother stayed with her. The daughter passed away that night. Her last words were, "I'm not afraid anymore. Dad is here with me." The family found it comforting until her mother went home and discovered her husband had died on the couch during the night. The mother had expected to plan 1 funeral, but now had to plan 2. In the same hospital, there's also a legend about the ghost of a 10-year-old girl who was the first child to die there. Patients often report seeing her in a white hospital gown, with several shouting, "Get that little girl out of here." Even though no child is present, stories like these make you question what might exist beyond death. Story 31. The summer before my sophomore year of college, I had surgery on both legs, which led to a longer than expected recovery. I eventually had to withdraw from school for the year and move back home. After 4 months of healing, I got a job as a server at a popular restaurant chain where I became friends with 2 coworkers, Oscar and Louie. Oscar was a friendly, laid-back guy, while Louie, a New Yorker, had a cocky attitude but was fun to be around. One night, we went to Oscar's house to watch an NBA playoff game. His parents didn't know us, so we introduced ourselves. Oscar's mom was kind to me but had a strange reaction when she met Louie. She asked to speak with Oscar privately. When Oscar came back, we asked what was up, but he brushed it off, saying it was nothing. Later that night, after Louie left, Oscar told me his mom had pulled him aside because she'd had a nightmare the night before. In the dream, Oscar met someone named Louise, and it brought nothing but trouble. She warned him to be careful around Louie. We laughed it off at the time, though the warning stayed in the back of our minds. A couple of weeks later, I got a call from a female coworker, sobbing and asking me to meet her at another friend's house. When I arrived, I found her with Oscar, and she told us that Louie had raped her the night before. Oscar and I exchanged a look but didn't say anything about his mom's warning. To this day, I can't shake the chills I get when I think about how Oscar's mom seemed to know Louis would cause trouble. Whether it was intuition or something else, her warning turned out to be tragically accurate. Story 32. This is a true story I witnessed firsthand, and as someone who's highly skeptical and logic-driven, it still shakes me to this day. My mother, who grew up in Syria, often claimed that her dreams carried meanings. I always dismissed it, chalking it up to confirmation bias. People remember the dreams that seem to come true and conveniently forget the ones that don't. When I was about 15, one morning just before midday, my mom came into the kitchen visibly shaken. She started crying, which was unusual. While she often spoke lightly about her dreams, they had never affected her emotionally like this before. Concerned, we asked what was wrong. She told us she'd had a bad dream about her elderly mother, who lived in Syria while we were in Australia. In her dream, my grandmother was holding her head in her hands as if she was in pain. That was all. A simple, unsettling image. We tried to comfort her, saying it was just a dream and nothing to worry about, but she remained upset. Later that afternoon, we decided to call my grandmother to reassure my mom. When my uncle answered the phone, he told us that my grandmother was fine. However, earlier that morning, she had tripped and hit her face on a cupboard. She had a bruise near her eye but was otherwise okay. We were all surprised by the accuracy of my mom's dream, though we brushed it off as a strange coincidence. My mom spoke to her mother, caught up on family gossip, said "I love you," and hung up. We thought this would put her at ease, but instead her worry seemed to deepen. She began crying even harder, shutting herself in her room and refusing to talk to us. Hours later, the phone rang again. My dad answered. It was my uncle. He told us that just minutes ago, my grandmother had passed away from a sudden stroke. We went together to my mom's room to break the news, but before we could say anything, she looked at us through her tears, shook her head and said, "I already know." We all hugged her as she wept. I've always been a skeptic, but I can't explain what happened that day. My mom's dream and her deep sense of foreboding were beyond anything I can rationalize. Even now, it sends chills down my spine to think about it. Story 33. This happened to me, and it still creeps me out to this day. I was driving through West Texas on my way to California and decided to take a detour on Highway 41 to visit a friend who was studying bats at Devil's Sinkhole. I stopped at the only gas station for miles to fill up, use the bathroom, and grab a snack. It was one of those old, run-down gas stations from the 70s with outdated pumps that required prepaying inside. Inside, everything felt off. The shelves were lined with dusty, expired snacks, and the refrigerators didn't seem to be running, making it unbearably hot. While I was browsing, I glanced out the window and saw one of the employees walking around my car, running his fingers along the trunk. Then I watched as he tried the driver's side door handle. I turned to the man behind the counter and said angrily, "He's trying to get into my car." The cashier, eerily calm, glanced outside and replied, "I don't see him doing anything," all while maintaining flat, unwavering eye contact. Then he subtly reached under the counter for something. That's when my fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. I pushed open the door, screamed at the guy outside to get away from my car, and bolted for the driver's seat. Somehow I managed to unlock it, jump in, and speed off before the man inside could follow me. In my rearview mirror, I looked back to see if they were chasing me in the truck parked outside, but the adrenaline made everything a blur. I called the police about 20 minutes later, but they told me they wouldn't waste resources going out there since nothing had actually happened. To this day, I still shudder at the memory of that cashier's unflinching stare as he reached under the counter, and I wonder what might have happened if I hadn't left so quickly. Story 34. When I was in 11th grade, my math teacher shared a story that has stayed with me ever since. He was talking about how everything happens for a reason and why it's always important to be kind to others. At first, I wasn't paying much attention, but then he shared something personal. He explained that when he was a senior in university, he decided to spend his final days on campus sitting with people who were alone in the cafeteria. One day, he approached a girl sitting by herself and asked if he could join her. She seemed hesitant at first, but eventually agreed. They talked for a while, and out of curiosity, she asked him why he had chosen to sit with her. He explained that he wanted to make a habit of connecting with people he didn't know. The girl then shared something that gave him chills. In high school, she was shy and unpopular, often spending her lunch breaks alone in the library. One day, toward the end of the school year, a group of popular girls invited her to have lunch with them. At first, she said no, shocked by their invitation. But they insisted, and she reluctantly agreed. They got into one of the girls' cars and headed to a restaurant off campus. As they were driving, dozens of police cars sped past them in the opposite direction. She later learned that they were responding to the Columbine High School shooting. It was April 20th, 1999, and the majority of the shootings took place in the library, where she would have been if those girls hadn't reached out to her that day. Her story deeply affected him, reinforcing the idea that even small acts of kindness can have life-altering consequences. Story 35. This story was told to me by my friend Jacob, and it still creeps me out. Jacob's mother was a drug addict, and while his father didn't have major issues, he stayed with her despite everything. One night, when Jacob and his dad were asleep in the same room, they were woken by loud banging, scratching, and movement coming from his mother's room down the hall. Jacob's dad jumped out of bed and ran to her door, pounding on it. When she opened it, she yelled at him for waking her up, claiming she'd been asleep the whole time. But something was off. The window in her room was wide open, and the TV had been moved across the room, its screen facing outside. Alarmed, Jacob's dad shut the window, grabbed a bat, and locked her room from the outside, making her sleep in the living room. He stayed awake for most of the night. The next morning at dawn, Jacob's dad woke him up. Jacob went to the kitchen to find his mom already there. As he ate cereal, his dad entered the room, wide-eyed, and motioned for them to be silent. They all froze as they heard something shuffling on the roof, moving from edge to edge. Terrified, they stayed quiet until the noises stopped. Jacob's grandmother was called, and she agreed to let them stay at her place. As they waited for her to pick them up, Jacob sat on the couch. The house was silent except for his thoughts. Then he glanced at the door to an empty room in the hallway and froze. A long, unnatural finger was wrapped around the edge of the door. Jacob screamed and pointed, and his dad grabbed him, ushering everyone outside. They fled to a gas station and waited until his grandmother arrived. Jacob later described the finger as looking unnaturally long and wide, almost like a foam finger, but with an unsettlingly human texture. When they returned to the house to gather their belongings, nothing was stolen, but the window in the empty room was wide open. They never went back after moving out. Story 36. This chilling tale from NH Magazine recounts an incident at the Lakes of the Clouds hut on Mount Washington. In the spring, an AMC crew member named George was sent to assess winter damage and report back any equipment needed for repairs. The hut's windows had been securely boarded for the harsh winter, and George arrived safely, settling in to rest after his long trek. That evening, the base crew tried to contact him via radio to confirm his arrival, but George didn't respond. Initially, they weren't alarmed, assuming he might be out exploring. However, by 8 p.m., with no word from him, they began to worry. The next morning, a group of crew members set out to check on him. When they arrived, George's belongings were scattered on the dining room floor, and his radio was still powered on, but there was no sign of him. They called out and searched the hut, their flashlights cutting through the eerie darkness. Finally, they heard a faint whimper coming from under the kitchen sink. When they opened the cabinet, they found George crouched inside, clutching an axe and shaking violently. Terrified, George repeatedly begged them, "Just get me the hell out of here." They helped him outside and back down the mountain, calling for an ambulance to meet them at the base. George refused to explain what had happened until weeks later when, still recovering in the hospital, he confided in a friend. George explained that after arriving at the hut, he rested in the dining room, unpacking his supplies. He felt someone behind him, as though about to touch his shoulders. Turning quickly, he saw a grotesque, distorted face pressed against the dining room window. The windows were boarded from the outside, but the face seemed to be peering through the boards. Panicking, George backed away, only to see the same face in another window, and then another. It appeared in every pane, as though moving through the wood itself. He remembered the face melting into the room before everything went black. George never returned to the hut or the AMC crew, and whatever happened on that mountain haunted him for the rest of his life. Story 37. In November, my wife and I bought a house, but our lease on the apartment didn't end until December 31st, so we procrastinated and waited until the last minute to move out. On the day before the lease ended, we were frantically packing and making trips to the dumpster to clear out what was left. My wife was packing, my son and older daughter were helping take out trash, and our youngest daughter, just 6 months old, was sitting in her car seat in the living room. The building was unusually quiet. Our college student neighbors were out of town, and the family across the hall had just left for the evening, congratulating us on the new house as they went. We were so focused on our tasks that none of us noticed when the mood shifted. My youngest daughter, who had been giggling to herself, suddenly went silent. None of us noticed that the front door had been left wide open. It wasn't until my daughter's scream pierced the air that everything came to a halt. My son was the first to hear her since he was in the kitchen right next to the living room. He called out, and I sprinted toward the sound, almost knocking over my older daughter. My wife, who had stepped out of the room just moments before, rushed in ahead of me. My daughter was screaming uncontrollably in her car seat, and nothing we did seemed to calm her. As I focused on her, I almost missed my son standing still in the kitchen, staring at something. "Daddy, the door's open," he whispered, his voice trembling. Annoyed, I asked him why he didn't close it. I assumed he or his sister had forgotten in their excitement. But as I moved toward the door, I noticed something odd. It was pitch black outside. There were no lights on the stairs or in the hallway leading to our door. Nothing but the faint light spilling from our nearly empty living room. That's when I saw it, a small figure in the shadows. My son must have noticed it before I did because he was frozen, eyes locked on the doorway. Stepping closer, I realized it was a child. A boy, no older than 5, stood there. His hair was messy, his face smudged with dirt, and he wore no shoes. I didn't recognize him, which was strange since I knew the faces of most of our neighbors. My wife, still comforting our screaming daughter, also looked confused. I glanced into the hallway, searching for a parent, but saw no one. Just as I started to ask the boy where his parents were, he abruptly spoke. "I'll take the baby," he said, his voice monotone. His face tilted downward, eyes fixed somewhere beyond me, on my daughter. He had no expression, no smile, nothing but a blank stare framed by unkempt hair. Before I could respond, a woman's voice called from down the hall. "Come here," she said sharply. I turned to see her walking quickly toward us, but something felt off. I hadn't heard any doors open or close, and I hadn't seen her approach. It was as if she had materialized from the darkness. She took the boy by the arm and hurried him away without so much as a word to me. I didn't recognize her either. The two disappeared into the shadows at the end of the hall. I stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what had just happened. My wife called out, asking if everything was okay, but I had no answer. We locked the door and continued packing, but I couldn't shake the image of that boy's blank stare or his chilling words. Story 38. My mom told me this story a while ago, and it still gives me chills. One late night, she and my dad were in a taxi heading home. They noticed the driver was taking an unusual route, but assuming it might be a shortcut or just a way to rack up the meter, they didn't think much of it. That was until my mom noticed a subtle exchange of looks between the driver and 3 men at a bus stop. The men immediately got on a bus, which struck her as odd but not alarming at first. A few minutes later, the driver suddenly turned down a dark, deserted road and stopped. He told my parents there was an issue with the car and asked them to stay seated while he checked it out. The moment he got out and went around to the back of the taxi, my mom's instincts kicked in. She grabbed my dad's hand, opened the door, and dragged him out. They ran as fast as they could until they reached a street with more people. From a safe distance, they turned back and saw the bus stop. The 3 men my mom had noticed earlier were getting off the bus and heading in the direction of the alley the taxi had just turned into. To this day, my mom is convinced that if they hadn't run, something terrible would have happened that night. Story 39. When I was about 10, my family lived in a small neighborhood with a gated community pool and jacuzzi. My dad, brother, and I would often go there in the evenings when it was usually empty. One winter night, the 3 of us were in the jacuzzi. My brother and I throwing bouncy balls around and annoying my dad, who was trying to relax. At some point, I threw my ball too hard and it flew out of the jacuzzi area, rolling into a bush by the large, dark swimming pool about 100 feet away. Thinking I'd probably lost it, I decided to check anyway. I got out of the jacuzzi and walked toward the bush. As I approached, I heard rustling coming from it. I froze, my timid 10-year-old self unsure of what to do. Then out of the bush, a man stood up. He was in his mid-40s, wearing only underwear, and just stared at me without saying a word. Terrified, I ran back to the jacuzzi as fast as I could and jumped in, crashing into the water. My dad, irritated by my splash, started to scold me until I blurted out, "There's a man in the bush." My dad stood up and looked over, spotting the man who was still standing there, staring silently. "Hey, what are you doing?" my dad called out. The man didn't respond, just kept staring. Then my dad yelled, "What the F are you doing?" A rare moment, since he almost never swore. Finally, the man sprinted away, scaling the 7 to 8 foot barbed wire fence surrounding the pool area and disappearing down the street. My dad realized the man didn't live in our neighborhood, as we knew all our neighbors. On the way home, my dad said, "Don't tell your mom. She won't let us come down here anymore." To this day, at 26 years old, I still haven't told her. That man's silent, unblinking stare remains burned into my memory. Story 40. A friend of a friend went on a spring break trip to the Caribbean with some girls from her sorority. While out at a club, one of the girls met a suave, charming guy. They hit it off and went to another room to hook up. However, the session was cut short when her sorority sisters insisted they leave to head back to their hotel. The girl thanked her friends for stepping in because the guy had been trying hard to convince her to come home with him. They exchanged numbers, and she thought little more of it. A couple of days later, the girl developed a rash around her mouth. Meanwhile, the guy from the club was blowing up her phone with calls and texts, persistently asking her to come over. Concerned about the rash, she went to a local doctor. As the doctor examined her, they began asking more questions about her recent sexual activity. She mentioned the man from the club. The doctor informed her that the bacteria causing the rash was only found on decaying human flesh. Alarmed, the authorities were notified, and the man's contact information was retrieved from her phone. When the police raided his home, they discovered a horrifying scene. The house was full of dismembered, rotting bodies of women. He had been luring girls home, raping and murdering them, and then continuing to have hours with their corpses for days or even weeks after their deaths. As if that weren't enough, he had been consuming parts of the victims as well. The girl's chance decision not to go home with him likely saved her life. Story 41. This happened during my senior year of college over Christmas break in 2006. I was house sitting for one of my professors while he was out of town for a bowl game. The house was on a large, isolated piece of land in the middle of nowhere, complete with horses, fishing, and a gator to ride around. My girlfriend at the time came with me to keep me company. The first 2 nights were uneventful, but the last night took a turn. My professor's small, fluffy dog started barking furiously at the back door. At first, we brushed it off, figuring it might be a coyote, but to be safe, we brought the dog inside. After a while, the barking didn't stop, and we started feeling uneasy. My girlfriend decided to check outside, claiming she saw something small and gray, which she assumed was a coyote, run off into the distance. Relieved, we settled back inside. Not long after, the dog began barking at the window on the other side of the house. We tried to ignore it, but the tension grew. Eventually, we decided to call it a night and get into bed. As we lay there in silence, I heard it. A faint, eerie voice. It sounded like a young girl softly singing a lullaby. I didn't say anything, hoping it was just my imagination. Then my girlfriend broke the silence. "Let's get the F out of here," she said. I asked why, and she replied, "You didn't hear that little girl singing?" So that was all it took. "Okay, let's get the F out," I said, and we scrambled to leave. I called someone on my phone to talk to us as we walked to my car, just to keep us grounded. The next morning, I went back to clean up the house and finish my duties, but the memory of that night still sends chills down my spine.